Happy Monday, everyone, and welcome to another episode of 2Girls1GarbageCan, the Auspol podcast, where we try to make sense of the garbage can state of the current Australian political setup using the historical context that we have gleaned through our extensive research. This is the second part in a two-part series we are doing regarding Australia's racist immigration policy and what has influenced that policy throughout history. If you have not yet caught up on episode 1, please do that first. Episode 2 will not make as much sense if you have not listened to episode 1 beforehand. If, however, you are impatient and don't want to have to wait a week between part 1 and 2 of our episodes, please remember you can join up to our Ko-fi. Our Ko-fi members do receive our episodes in full without all of the naughty bits edited out a week in advance and without having to wait in between for parts 1 and 2 for our special episodes. You can join up for our Ko-fi for as little as $1 for our entry-level donations, and we absolutely love and adore all of our Ko-fi members and are always taking feedback from you. And our Ko-fi members are also able to give us suggestions for subjects they'd like us to cover. So if you would like to be able to dictate what we talk about in a future episode, make sure you jump over onto our Ko-fi and join up. The links are down below. And please, while you're down checking out our links, why don't you jump on to wherever we get our podcasts, give us a follow and rate us 5 stars, because it helps others to find the podcast. And you know they'll love it as much as you do. Thank you so much and enjoy the episode. The incident on the Tampa is one that a lot of people our age will maybe be vaguely familiar with. This incident, which occurred on the 27th of August 2001, has shown the myth that the White Australia policy is dead and buried is a fiction in this country. A ship capsized off the coast of Western Australia and was picked up by the Norwegian freighter, the MV Tampa. The captain of the Tampa then radioed the Coast Guard in Australia asking to be able to make landfall, to be able to deliver the refugees to Christmas Island. The Tampa was denied. The 438 asylum seekers who had been picked up in the waters between Indonesia and Australia were left sitting on deck of the Tampa for 2 days. There was not enough food or water on board. The freighter, which had been en route from Fremantle to Singapore, answered the call from an Australian Coast Guard initially, who alerted them that there was a boat sinking in the region. So... yes, the Tampa affair. Yep. Yep. Makeshift accommodation and bathrooms were organised on the open air deck, and pregnant women were among the passengers on board. A delegation of 5 asylum seekers was taken to see the Tampa's captain, Arne Rinnan. They pleaded to be taken to Christmas Island, which was a mere 4 hours away, and threatened to jump ship if they were returned to Indonesia, which was 11 hours away. Rhiannon told the Coast Guard he planned to take the rescuees to Christmas Island, which was duly noted. However, some hours later, Neville Nixon of the Department of Immigration contacted Rinnan to inform him that the Tampa was not to enter Australian waters, and if it did so, Rinnan risked imprisonment and fines of up to 110,000 Australian dollars.
I'm keeping my mouth shut intentionally because, one, while I said it's probably not something that you're going to do, you immediately fucking rumbled me, and yes, it is. So I've already done a bunch of research on this topic. It's not exactly an uncommon thing for people talking about politics in this country to want to discuss.
Well, and again, the reason I wanted to talk about it at the moment is because of all the talk we've had about immigration that's been coming up
Yeah.
and the change that Albanese made to his cabinet by removing the immigration minister who had previously been an advocate for asylum seekers and refugees. He was a legal advocate for
Mm-hmm.
them. His decision to
Yep.
remove him from the immigration minister portfolio speaks volumes to the direction that Albanese's ministerialship is heading in terms of their views of asylum seekers and refugees.
Mm-hmm.
So it's timely, which is probably why it was on both of our minds.
Yeah, 100%.
Yes.
Like, we are both seeing the writing on the wall.
Yeah. It was, in fact, the Prime Minister, John Howard, who decided to prevent the Tampa from entering Australia. The decision...
No
What?
way.
Not racist, Johnny boy.
Joking.
Who could have seen that coming?
Oh, old eyebrows himself.
Yeah.
Holy fuck.
The decision heralded the beginning of a new executive-led change in policy, which has been the underlying basis of the approach to asylum seekers attempting to reach Australia by boat ever since. When the 438 asylum seekers left Indonesia on the Palapa, Australia's policy was to rescue asylum seekers at sea and detain them in Australia while their claims for detection were processed. If their claims were successful, they would be released into the community on permanent protection visas. If they weren't, then they would be returned to their country of origin. On the 8th of October, 6 weeks after the Tampa was told it could not enter into Australia waters, the Palpa survivors were forcibly removed from the HMAS Manoora onto Nauru. In the intervening period, the Australian government had introduced a policy of boat turnbacks. A couple of other really important things to know about these boats. They often run out of fuel before they even reach Australia, which is why they often had to be rescued in the first place. They do not have enough supplies on board for the one-way trip, let alone a two-way trip. These people are very, very desperate. They don't have a backup plan. There is nothing else for them. So
yeah, it's like full send.
So a policy of boat turnbacks is 100% a policy of death for asylum seekers.
Yeah.
And the Australian government at the time they made this policy were aware of that. They were aware what this policy, the implications would be. A lot of people like to credit the Labor government with the beginning of the offshore detention processing that occurred. It was in fact started under Howard but was formalised under the Labor Party. So it has always been a bipartisan policy to be as abhorrent as possible to asylum seekers and refugees. Sorry.
The racism runs deep.
Yeah. Yeah. So the narrative that was being constructed at this time was that the Australian government were trying to prevent deaths at sea by ensuring everyone who got on a boat knew that the boat would not end up in Australia, and therefore preventing them from crossing the more treacherous waters that lay in between countries like Indonesia and Australia. They would land somewhere like Indonesia and decide they were safe enough there because they had no hope of landing in Australia anyway, and the waters were just too not worth the risk. And this also forms another pattern that we see being used today with Australian immigration policy, which is they try and use a humanitarian angle to explain their inhumanitarian policy. So we're not going to rescue people at sea because it's just going to encourage more people to come. And so in order to save more lives, we're going to let these ones drown. And it's the same thing with offshore detention processing. The official government policy officially was to ensure that offshore detention processing was so abhorrent, the conditions were so abhorrent, and the chances of getting into Australia so minimal that it would discourage anyone from leaving the horrendous conditions they were currently experiencing in their war-torn, dictatorship-led, American-bombed backyards. That has been the Australian government's policy.
Standing orders.
So the ability to both construct and implement this policy, given that there was only a few months before an election, was an extraordinary achievement of the Howard government, particularly given it involved a lot of complex negotiations with a foreign country, being Nauru. So again, people People credit the Australian Labor government with the beginning of offshore detention processing, but this is the birth of offshore detention processing, and it was started by the Howard government. So also in this 6-week period, there were 10 other boats which were now officially labelled suspected illegal entry vessels, or SEAVs, that attempted to reach Christmas Island. It was a period of high drama. The Australian Navy was under orders to forcibly return boats to Indonesia under Operation Relax. Several boats during this time sank while under Navy observation. Despite the best efforts of Navy personnel to rescue asylum seekers flailing in the open sea, many drowned. In the case of Sieve 4, the fourth boat identified, cabinet ministers seized on a Navy communication feed that children were being thrown overboard. They immediately made the allegation public. Howard and his immigration ministers declared these were not the type of people that Australia wanted. Whew. The government maintained its reliance on unverified naval intelligence right up to the federal election on November 10 without providing the Navy with an opportunity to correct the record. This politicisation of Navy information was the subject of a Senate inquiry in the next Parliament. Boats ceased arriving altogether after the Sieve 10 sank on October 19, killing more than 350 of its 400 passengers. The exact circumstances of the sinking of Sieve 10 remain uncertain. There can be little doubt, however, that its sinking had a significant deterrent effect on asylum seekers in Indonesia, considering the journey to Christmas Island by boat. So once again, the Australian government's policy of just treating these people as inhumanely as possible had the desired effect.
Yep. And again and again and again, we see from Australian political leaders just this vast, yawning ocean of... Fuck, I don't even know the words, man. Like...
Yeah.
It's just a complete lack of empathy for human beings going through hell. Like, how can you look? And this is the thing that I will never understand, right? Is how can you look at a person who is struggling, who is going through hell, and not feel for them? It is part of the human condition to feel empathy for your fellow person. That is how humanity has survived.
Yeah.
It just boggles the mind. Like, it really does. And it hurts a bit to consider that potentially the person who serves me behind the counter at a petrol station or at a bar holds those sort of thoughts.
Yeah.
Like, the lack of empathy for somebody that doesn't look like them.
Yeah. Yep. There's a couple of different things about the reason that the Tampa sort of changed everything at the time as well, and a lot of it has to do with what happened shortly after. So the Tampa reached the Palapa on the morning of the 26th of August 2001, which was a Sunday, minutes before the Palapa disappeared into the ocean. His crew rescued everyone on board, including 43 children and 3 pregnant women. The law of the sea mandated he bring the rescue passengers to the nearest port, being Christmas Island, again, being 4 hours away, as we discussed earlier, but was instructed by the Australian government to take them 11 hours away back to Indonesia, which, and where we left Rinnan at this time, he had just been threatened that if he did enter Australian waters, he would be threatened with jail time and a $110,000 fine for himself. So he turned his ship away from Christmas Island to start off with, but he was petitioned by those on board. Their health was getting worse and several had slipped into unconsciousness. He told Australian officials, the medical situation on board is critical. If it is not addressed immediately, people will die. For the third time, he turned the boat towards Australian waters. He crossed Australia's maritime boundary shortly before noon on the 29th of August. The Australian government advised him that he was in flagrant breach of Australian law, and when he anchored off of Christmas Island's Flying Fish Cove, they sent 45 SAS troops to seize control of the ship. Peter Tinley, who was second in command of the SAS that day, would later report he had been briefed for a potentially hostile and dangerous situation.
Okay, we're going to take a small pause.
Yeah.
The fact that he says that he'd been briefed for a hostile and dangerous situation is setting him up to be more likely to be trigger happy.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah. And that's why I had to laugh when I said it, because he had been briefed for a potentially hostile and dangerous situation as an SAS officer. Like, if you're being called in, it's dangerous. If they're telling you that it's a dangerous and hostile situation, you're going to assume it's 100, 500. Like, you know what I mean? You're an SAS officer. It's already dangerous if you're there.
Yeah, exactly. And, like, this is a ship, a vessel that has its crew and sick asylum seekers.
Yeah. And that's what he said.
How fucking dangerous can they be?
He said, instead, I found 400 plus ordinary refugees, very hungry, some who needed medical attention urgently, very scared and uncertain about what was happening, and particularly a very concerned sea captain who just wanted to offload his human cargo and discharge his duty according to international law. So he's now found himself in this legal situation, Captain Arne Rinnan. By the 6th of September 2001, he finally made it to Singapore. But the decision about what was to happen to him wasn't handed down until the 11th of September 2001. And it was handed down that morning, thankfully. If it had been handed down later in the day, it might have been a different outcome.
Yep.
A handwritten note was also thrust into the hands of the Norwegian ambassador who had come on board with the SAS officers. It was a formal request for asylum in Australia. You know well about the long war and its tragic human consequences, and you know about the genocide and massacres going on in our country, it read, which is talking about Afghanistan at the time. Again, Australia was at war in this country.
Yep. Troops on the ground.
We have no way but to run out of our dear homeland and to seek a peaceful asylum. In Canberra that evening, Howard introduced the Border Protection Bill to Parliament, giving the government sweeping powers to refuse entry to people seeking asylum by sea. The Act would be made retrospective to 9 a.m. that day, 2.5 hours before the Tampa entered Australian waters.
You're getting this, right? You're understanding the parallel that we have to today.
What were they?
The raising of the terror threat level.
They were.
You're getting this, right? The reason we're talking about it.
They were racing to try.
I just want to make sure that the subtext isn't lost on.
They were racing to try and get immigration law reform passed before the Supreme Court of Australia could hand down a decision saying that they were treating immigration detainees unlawfully. Who did that? When?
Yeah. I wonder.
Yeah. Howard's not in power anymore, but it's still happening. Who would have thought?
Yep.
So this would be just the first in a sweep of dramatic legislative and policy change that would transform the Australian asylum regime. Australia would legally excise Christmas and other islands from its territory for the purpose of migration. The Defence Force and Border Authorities would be given new rules of engagement to intercept and force boats back to Indonesia. And a Pacific solution was negotiated with Papua New Guinea and Nauru, allowing Australia to build detention centres on their islands. The Tampa also changed the way Australia understood and spoke about the movements of people. Migration became an issue of border protection and threats to national security. Those arriving on boats were no longer asylum seekers, but illegals. Ministers would publicly allege asylum seekers could be murderers, could be terrorists, and that whole villages were coming to Australia in uncontrolled floods. we have to admit that while the Tampa is the ship that changed everything, the crisis did not exist in a vacuum. And the fact that the decision regarding the captain of the Tampa, Captain Rinnan, was handed down on the 11th of September definitely played a part in the pushback that occurred afterwards. The Australian government used the decision, the fact that these people were basically allowed to come here and the Australian government had no power to stop them, as grounds to push through even stronger legislative changes to protect the borders from terrorists.
Mm-hmm.
So,
read brown people.
Yeah. It came at a time as well when there had been escalating numbers of boats arriving to Australia's northwest, from 298 to 5,500 in 2001. Though our boat arrivals have only ever made up between 1% to 2% of our migration, so they've never been a large portion of it at all.
Yep.
Philip Ruddock was Immigration Minister when the Tampa arrived into Australian waters. He says he remembers the morning of urgent phone calls and a meeting with Howard before a quick cabinet meeting. It was initially understood that the Tampa would sail for Merak before reports that Rinnan was under duress, that he and his crew felt very much at risk, and that he would head for Christmas Island. He was told that he couldn't bring the vessel into Australian waters and that he should turn around. So the message that was being delivering to them was that the captain felt that he was under risk. The captain maintains, and the Navy even maintains through communications that they had back and forward, that the risk was to the people on board, as in their health was the risk.
Mm-hmm.
This message was being either knowingly or unknowingly twisted as it went up the chain.
This shit makes me angry. And
yes,
it makes me want to headbutt an entire cabinet of politicians, just for some existential payback.
And interestingly enough, Ruddock says, since in reflecting on the circumstances of what happened at the time, he says, now I don't regard it so much as a matter of border protection. Rather, it is a matter of maintaining integrity and helping those who need help the most. I have a long-standing, passionate view about the need for Australia to be a humane country, helping refugees who are most vulnerable. That is not what we did. That is not what we're doing. Today, we have more than 80 million people displaced around the world. 30 million of those have been found to be refugees. To those who criticise our policies, I ask, can we take them all? I assert, if you can't take them all, who do you take? Do you take those who've got money and who are free enough to travel, or do you take those who are the most vulnerable? Who are the people we ought to be resettling?
Well, I mean, that's all well and good, Philip Ruddock.
Yeah.
But there was a time when you had power to enact that policy.
And it's very much
and
when
now
they
when
leave.
You're out of office and out of politics entirely, all well and good to have the fucking realization later. Like, congrats, you're well done. You're trying to clean up your image, but you're still the cunt that delivered the policy. Ruddock.
Yeah. Yeah.
Excuse me.
And even at the time, Ruddock said that the decisions that came out of the Tampa's arrival were appropriate. And at the time, he said, were guided by the initial rationale to maintain integrity in the migration process. So he's not saying that he thinks that what all they did was horrendous. He's saying that it's not all about protecting our border. It was about doing this humanely and trying to make sure the people who came here were the most vulnerable and not just the people who had a lot of money to pay people to come over here by boat. But that's not what you were doing, Phil. You can try and convince yourself in hindsight that, you were trying to make it fair for the people who couldn't afford to come here. But no.
It genuinely reeks of, I haven't had a good night's sleep since I passed that policy, and I'm trying to make it up in my brain so I can sleep again.
Yeah. I did a bad thing and I want Mum to forgive me, and so I'm going to make up in, hindsight what it was really about. Do you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of that time Tati Westbrook got upset at James Charles because he promoted her competition, Sugar Bear Hair, and she tried to make it
Hmm.
about him doing all this other dodgy stuff, but it was really just she was annoyed
Hmm.
because he promoted her competition's hair vitamins. But then it turns out he
Yep.
was doing all this dodgy stuff, and then she tried to cover up and
Yep.
cover for him because he was advertising her hair vitamins.
Yep. Oh
That's
my
what
god.
Ruddock sounds like. He's
Oh
like
yeah.
Darty Westbrook with Sugar Bear hair.
My nesting partner was deep into drama YouTube at the time that was
Oh,
happening,
yeah.
so I'm a full bottle on that whole situation. Getting back to Philip Ruddock trying to whitewash his own image for himself, mentioned George Bush Jr. Is an example. He is trying to change his image now, rather than being the crux of a terrible war
World tourism.
that America had no place being in yet again. He is now he's now trying to paint himself as this fatherly figure who does paintings. All right, let's continue. I've ranted about Philip Ruddock
All
enough.
right. Yeah. So Justice Tony North was the duty judge on the federal court when the Victoria Council for Civil Liberties filed an urgent case to the detention of those on board Tampa. And for people who don't know, Julian Burnside was the lawyer who was defending the asylum seekers and the captain in this case. So amazing man made his name in this case, even though before that he had not been doing this kind of work. He'd been doing a lot of work in union and
Oh wow,
yeah, like
that's quite the
corporate,
shift.
yeah. And it's based on the cab rank rule. So in Australian law,
Mm.
if you're the next lawyer, you're the next cab off the rank, you have to take the case unless there's some reason you can't. He could have actually said no to the case because he was supposed to be going away on holiday, but his partner said, no, you have to take this case. This is going to be massive. This is going to be absolutely massive. You can't say no to this.
Yep.
So he was like, oh,
Yep.
okay, then fine. And thank fuck, because he's one of the most brilliant legal minds we have in the country.
Oh my word, yeah.
Yeah. So the judge says that it was a dramatic and dynamic situation. The case repeatedly seemed to shift. The sands of public opinion were constantly shifting. There were constantly new declarations coming in from the Prime Minister. There was new legislation being passed that was relevant based on the fact that they kept predating it. And there were new developments that kept coming through from the deck of the ship, and information regarding misinformation that the government had been pushing about what was happening that morning on board the Tampa, including the miscommunication about the duress that the captain was feeling and the information that the Navy was hearing that was being sort of transmitted across naval radios that the government went grabbing and using, even though they weren't checking that it was correct or not. It was just chatter that they were hearing on the radios. So the Navy were pissed at them as well. The Navy were trying to get them to stop doing that. Judge North said that they were very determined, for the sake of the reputation of the federal court, that the matter be determined quickly and try and keep it as respectful as possible. There were people at sea, troops going on board. It was a minute-by-minute proposition. At one stage, we were contemplating taking evidence from sea. In a judgment delivered just hours before the 9/11 attacks, North found the 433 people on the Tampa were unlawfully held there by Australia, which had committed to retaining complete control over the bodies and destinies of the rescuees. So, at a distance of 2 decades, North's position remains. He says, I thought that if the law didn't provide for the state to answer for holding those rescuees offshore in a confined space with nowhere else to go, that sounded contrary to basic legal principle. He saw parallels with the 1939 case of the MS St. Louis carrying 900 refugees from Nazi Germany. The ship was refused entry in Cuba, the USA, and Canada before it was forced to return to Europe. Up to a quarter of its passengers would then die in Nazi death camps. North's judgment however, was overturned 2-1 by the full bench of the federal court after the government appealed. The court ruled, in the words of Justice Robert French, later Chief Justice of the High Court, that the government could stop those on board the Tampa from entering Australia. The power to determine who may come into Australia is so central to Australia's sovereignty that it is not to be supposed that the government of the nation would lack the power to prevent people not part of the Australian community from entering. As North points out, the 4 judges who heard the Tampa case, 2 decided in favour of the government's action, 2 against. The result, he says, could easily have gone the other way. What stands out now is that court case has become something of a footnote because we live under a system where Parliament is sovereign. At the end of the day, Parliament decides what it wanted to do. The government wanted to pursue its policies, and in a failure of moral commitment, the Labor Party fell in behind them. I saw that as a real moment of moral reckoning. You had a decision of the court that allowed the government to say, we will take the humane approach, and that opportunity was missed. Yeah, if only that was in place when all the white cunts came over. As we saw back from 1901 with the White Australian policy that we then saw with our first, what was the name of the first ship we spoke about?
Oh, God, I don't
That was like a full hour ago, 2 hours ago.
And then some,
the Petriana on the 28th of November 1903.
Petriana, that's right.
All the way through to the Tampa in 2001, August 2001. You can see that nearly 100 years later, and the face of Australia has not changed at all.
And still to this day continues exactly as it
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah, I just thought that was a really great way to talk about the White Australia policy and to try and talk about try and bring up some discussion about our current discussions around immigration. So some of the facts that I wanted to talk about in terms of immigration, the most important things to remember is that migrants are a massive reason that the labour productivity market is boosted. It's not really possible for us to be able to boost the labour market to the extent that we're able to through immigration just via native-born workers. For a start, the cost that goes into producing a native-born worker to the age of 18 on behalf of the country is actually quite a big investment to have them, like all that resource that goes into it versus a migrant. Yeah. It's actually a massive boost to the economy, and I'm just talking about all the reasons like that people are stupid for complaining that migrants are stealing their jobs. On average, a region with a 10% larger migrant share, say like 0.33% or 33%, sorry, instead of 30%, had a 1.3% larger regional wage difference, which links a very, it shows, because it's more than a 0.2% difference, there is a effect, there is a non-insignificant effect between migration and wage growth for all workers involved. So more migration means more wage growth for everyone involved. Some other things, some other myths as well is that as far as getting on the welfare payments, you can't, basically. There is no welfare payments.
That is one of my least favourite arguments, like against migrants, because it is just so stupid and provably incorrect.
Yes. And the frustrating thing about it as well is you can tell people facts all day, every day. They're only looking for the facts that are going to back up their racism. Yeah. Like, you really just have to say to these people, just admit that you don't like looking around town and seeing brown people. It makes you uncomfortable. Yep. Which is just a sign to me that we need more brown people around your town, because if you saw them more often, you'd be less easily scared by them. Yeah, that was the episode for today.
Right. Well, thank you so much for going through that. Like, genuinely, I know often when I speak, I come across as sounding sarcastic, but I do want to say
Not
thank
at all.
you so much to not only you for doing all of the research, putting everything together, and delivering it in a way that, despite your, fears, wasn't nearly as boring as you thought it would be.
No.
No, not at all. Not at all. It was actually quite interesting and informative and very relevant to where we're at now. And that's
I tried to pull out all the examples because it makes it a bit easier, I think, when it's not just.
yeah,
And then they passed this legislation so they could do this awful thing.
yeah, exactly. Like, and that is important to know it as well, because so many people don't understand the purpose of certain legislation passing at certain times or certain government actions. They're just like, oh, they must know something, as you said earlier, because they're in a position of authority. People assume they know something we don't.
Appeal
But
to authority.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right. But I would also like to say a big thank you so much to all of you for joining us for this week's dive into the depths of the
Yes.
trash fire that is Australian politics. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, make sure to drop us a follow and do all the usual engagement things to help us get the word out there. You can find Tamara and myself on the social media links in the description below, but for now, it's garbage day, so the girls gotta take the trash out.
Bye.